Okay, people, so I thought I'd pop in and say good day. I was checking my subscription box this morning. It was practically Christmas. There it was, a whole series of videos from Conference Report. I was really happy to see it. I thought I would maybe try to pick up one of the issues that he had raised across several of the videos. I'm going to link the one called Consciousness that I thought was largely the one I'm going to try to respond to. But he was also situating some of this in terms of consciousness related to feeling, related to thinking, and trying to span not only the kinds of conscious experience or kinds of awareness that we can find, I guess, in the scale from yeasts and moss to, I guess, plants and bacteria, and then all the way up through various forms of animal life, mammals, higher primates, and then humans, and was also spanning, I guess, the range and kinds of experiences that we have from sleeping and dreaming and then wide awake and in various ways. And I thought one of the ways to hop into that discussion is, from my perspective, is it's phenomenologically the key issue is the distinction between reflective and pre-reflective consciousness. Okay, so there's reflective and there's pre-reflective consciousness, and it's sometimes called thetic and pre-thetic consciousness, but there is a kind of consciousness which seems non-positional, right? It's pre-thetic, right? It's to say that some kinds of consciousness, they it's also what Merleau-Ponty called the difference between operative intentionality, which is pre-reflective, and intentionality of act, right? The intentionality of act was Husserl's, positional thetic consciousness of an I there consciously directing various, I guess, intentional arcs, intentional rays that are, part of noetic experience. But I think all that stuff, it's so technical, right? I mean, that's probably just a bunch of word salad to people. I mean, there's all this sort of technical language that phenomenology has created to try to get at some of these very fine distinctions. But one of the best, I guess, places to go to the haggle here is from Sartre's book, Transcendence of the Ego. And in there, he's kind of saying, okay, there's this situation, and the situation is Peter needing to be helped. So I'm going about my business, and in my daily affairs, I come upon Peter, and he's in a situation that calls for help, and I can see him in a situation needing help. And then later in reflection, I transform that feeling consciousness. I render it into a reflective state, and I say, oh, that was my subjective appraisal, my act of valuing with regard to Peter's situation. And at that point, we sort of sever in our imagination the real relations as they're lived through in the world. That is, the real relations as they're lived through in the world is one where the values are in the landscape. The beauty is it's in the landscape. The feelings that we have for others, they're not registered as in us and of others. They're of the others, right? The ugliness of the other's face appears to be in the face. It doesn't appear to be one's subjective appraisal. Now, later in reflection, one can go, oh yes, of course. Well, admittedly, and then we get to these sort of complex analytic orientations, but pre-reflectively, right, or operationally, there's an expansive connectedness that sort of it momentarily either covers over or dissolves the distinctions between world and self, or maybe even self and other, that in spontaneous speech. Like, take even the spoken word here right now. Maybe we cut to that as an example. While you're spontaneously speaking, you don't try to select the words. In fact, the words are just pre-reflective. You're thinking about what you want to say, and it's the things that you're thinking about that call forth the words, and the words seem to be largely transparent to you. But when you are struggling to come up with what you want to talk about, or when you're trying to think about words, or when someone uses a foreign word, or when they use a common expression in an unfamiliar way, or when they have odd syntactical gymnastics, all this kind of stuff, then suddenly the words appear as things. There's a kind of reflection starts to occur where instead of attending from your words, you start to attend to them. Right? So again, it's a folding back over. And so it seems as if there are forms of folding back over. And so let's go back to the original argument that Fred had laid out in this consciousness video. Right? It's sort of like, and a lot of this is Alfred Korzybski's work, right? I mean, Korzybski's argument is roughly that organisms are able to abstract, and abstraction is a consciousness. That is, abstracting itself, filtering or mediating is a kind of consciousness, in the sense that you're not just representing, you're releasing and appropriating according to the kinds of capacities that you have for being communicated with by the potential field that's available there. And so there seems to be something like an abstracting process that it happens not necessarily with conscious direction and with guidance, but there's a spontaneous filtering that happens just at various levels. I mean, the way that the senses work, that would be just maybe a simple example. I mean, you could think of feelings, but then we talk about feelings, and it gets all these sort of interesting complexities. We could say the same about the senses, but there is a sense, I think, in which we all can, without too much haggle, I think we can all admit that we experience a very different dynamic when we think about the world of sight versus the world of sound. It's like hearing and seeing have very different properties. That is, they're kinds of abstracting that are modes of consciousness that open a spatial temporal field with very different horizons, right? I mean, examine them for yourself, the difference between seeing and hearing. But it's that process which gets more and more expansive, more and more complex, more and more able to interactively enfold and react back upon itself. And so I guess by the time you get to humanity, whatever that means, and again, it's not like it's an evolutionary scale, but that niche that somehow emerged that we call humanity, it's that we not only have very robust, complex forms of organizing consciousness by filtering our abstractions at increasing layers, higher and higher layers. I mean, we have forms of literacy, very complex forms of numeracy, very complex forms of now technological extension. But it's that we can be aware of our consciousness itself. That is, consciousness becomes reflective to itself. And so, I mean, we might imagine that, a stomach ache for an organism is an early form of reflection upon its normally pre-reflective operations. So the animal's wandering around about its way and it's eating various things, and then suddenly a kind of sickness falls upon it. It gets really ill. Well, the body loses its transparency, suddenly becomes opaque. It's no longer something attended from, but becomes something attended to. It's like the beginning of a reflective capacity, right? I mean, breakdowns of all sorts have that sort of reflection built into them. The degree to which that reflection can grow explicit, I mean, maybe that's one of those capacities that we're talking about. It seems as if a lot of this has to do with, why the brain is split in hemispheres and how the right and left hemisphere I guess, enable the capacity for one to reflect upon the other. And then by the time you get to the frontal cortex, which really was this radical revolution, that sort of separates primates from humans, right? There's whatever quarter inch of cortex there, that frontal lobe, those frontal cortex. It's as if there that has become the environment of the old brain, and it's now mediating between that, and it's the mode of reflection. And so I think part of the issue is, are many things which we think of as discrete, separate items, because language introduces it, things like thoughts and feelings and consciousness and awareness. I think we can use those terms, and we obviously have some sense of them, but it may be that there is, as Fred's suggesting, a much larger continuum across the lot, and it has the degree to which life unfolds without reflection. It just sort of operates. That our true self is a kind of unconscious operating, but that during moments of breakdown or dysfunction, when it's no longer adapted or it's no longer operating, it becomes reflective in some way. And again, we could get, I don't want to be reductive there. I'm not saying it's only in breakdown. We want to be very careful. Breakdown is clearly a place when it does introduce kinds of reflection, and a kind of transparency gets lost, and attention turns toward what attention had previously just been coming out from. Okay, but that's not the only thing. There are forms of, again, of beauty, of aesthetic pleasure. Poetry, I guess, would be an example of forms of writing where you're balancing between the appreciation of the content expressed, but also the form itself and the kind of contours and the shape of it. All that said, there does seem to be something like a relationship between transparency and opacity, or between pre-reflective absorption, whereby one and one's capacity is a self-effacement for the world. That is, we're capacity for world, and the world shows itself through our self-effacement. And yet, it's as if the body is a kind of network that allows multi-leveled reflections back upon itself. And the more integrated kind of harmonies that we can have, it's sort of like we've created a language that isn't simply an expression of the brain. I mean, this sort of Bob Pula, I was watching a video of him yesterday talking about Krzyzewski and saying, yeah, that Krzyzewski's discovery, and you can see it in the second edition, the preface to the second edition of Science and Sanity, where he's saying, the radical revolution in humanity and human consciousness began with language, because language was an expression of the brain that then reflexively acted back upon the brain. It created a system by producing something outward that then had a reality that could act back upon itself. And this has become amplified many, many fold with each subsequent communication technology. I mean, literacy so has transformed consciousness that I think people now experience a kind of literate consciousness, a very, very reflective, a very sort of reflective consciousness, and they seem to imagine that that's what consciousness itself is like. But it's really one of those possibilities that has come home to roost, given the kind of technological growth and capacity we now have. At any rate, Fred, it's great to see you, and hope everyone is doing well.